But what is being expressed here is that by seeing God, they were interacting with God at a personal level, that God was present with them. And then in verse 11 it says that God didn't rise against them in anger, but rather that they ate and drank. They had fellowship with God. They had a meal with God. I don't know if you've ever played that game where you ask the hypothetical question, if you could have a meal with any person living or dead, who would you eat with? You know, the fun of the game is imagining eating with naturalist David Attenborough or cricketer Kevin Peterson or President Barack Obama. That's the fun of it. It isn't actually the food. The idea that you might get to meet or know these people, that's the point of having a meal with someone. The point is the relationship, not the food. My wife Emma and I, we love to have people over for dinner, and the purpose is always the same. It's not about the eating. It's about knowing and caring for the people we've invited. And the point of this meal in Exodus chapter 24, verses 9 to 11, is that meals are shared with friends. God and Israel were friends. They were in a relationship with one another. Now, of course, this was not a relationship of equals. God is clearly in charge in this scenario. But that makes the fact that he would share a meal with his people all the more amazing. Israel enjoyed a covenant meal with the God of the universe, a meal which was representing the relationship that they had with God. And the meal in Exodus points us forward to and is fulfilled by Christ. Hours before Jesus went to the cross to shed his blood, to secure the new covenant, Jesus shared a meal with his disciples. And at the Last Supper, Jesus instructed them to eat, and to eat in remembrance of his death, which was to come. And when we eat the Lord's Supper, bread and wine, we look back to the cross, which actually secures our relationship with God. We look up to Christ, who's with his Father in heaven right now. He is reigning and alive in heaven right now. And we recognize that that Christ is acting on our behalf with his Father right now. He intercedes for us. And when we share in the Lord's Supper, we can look around to one another and be reminded that as a church, just like Israel in Exodus chapter 24, we're united to one another and we're united to God in fellowship. When we receive the Lord's Supper, it reminds us that salvation in Christ includes knowing God, knowing him personally. That Jesus received us as part of his worldwide family, this multinational family of God, the church. And this meal points us also forward to a day when we will eat with Jesus again. In the book of Revelation, there's this promise that when Jesus returns, that he will initiate with us a new covenant meal. In fact, it's a wedding banquet with Christ as the bridegroom. And guess what? Jersey Baptist Church will be there joining in with all of God's church because God's church is the bride. And the meal will celebrate God eternally uniting with his people in an eternal covenant relationship. A relationship that began with a promise and was completed with a marriage. But the best news of all is that right now we can have real, close, personal relationship with God because Christ has made it possible. He made a way for us to know God, to be in fellowship with God. And this is really good news, particularly if you're someone right now who feels alone in the world. One of the casualties of self-isolation and social distancing and the lockdown is that we can feel incredibly disconnected and alone. I was talking to a friend of mine just this last week, and he said, the biggest part of this thing is I just feel alone. I feel lonely. I don't feel like I'm connecting to people the way that I ought to. And I said, yeah, you're probably right. But for those of us who have put our faith in Christ, we have the assurance that nothing can separate us from the love of God found in Christ Jesus. We have constant access to God. We can turn to him and speak to him at any moment, trusting that he will listen. And we can hear from God through the Bible. God speaks to us from His Word. Every time we open up the Bible, God is communicating to us. He's telling us about Himself through His Son, Jesus. And when we read the Bible, we can trust that God is speaking to us through His Word. And this is because Jesus secures for us a forever relationship with God. And all we have to do is put our faith in Him.